The way we ask questions in our classroom can act as a powerful positive or negative mindset mover. It can encourage students to go into their learning zones, or it can discourage that. And so what I want to share with you in this lesson is a way of structuring what Art Costa describes as powerful questions. Questions that elicit a thoughtful response. And there are 5 qualities to these powerful questions. And I hasten to add that as you start to work with these questions, the structure of these questions, don't try to work with all 5 of these qualities at once. Slowly add them into your questioning strategies. And secondly, not all situations demand powerful questions. So it's not something that will replace our questioning, but rather a way of adding to the richness of our questioning in classrooms. So let's talk about these 5 qualities of powerful questions and how they act as positive mindset movers. The first quality is that we want to ask questions that are plural. Rather than asking for the answer, where there's only one and you're going to get it right or you're not, we ask for one of the answers. So for example, as a science teacher, rather than asking, why did this experiment explode? See, when I ask it that way, why did the experiment explode? The student can get it right or get it wrong, but there's only one chance that they're going to get it right. When I ask for what is one reason the experiment exploded, the students at least now got several options to choose from. Still right or wrong, but they've got a better shot at getting it right. So it makes it a little bit easier to get right. But this whole right-wrong thing, that's a really difficult thing for a student on the low growth end of the continuum. So what can we do about that? What we can do about that is that we build in a tentative statement to our questions. So instead of asking for the answer, we ask for a possible answer. An answer that could be right, that might be right. So instead of asking, building on the example, what is one of the reasons this experiment exploded? You ask instead, what might be one of the reasons this experiment exploded? What could be? What's a possible? Adding that tentative nature to the question, building in the possibility that it could be right or wrong, takes the sting out of the question for a student. When you ask a student, particularly one towards the low growth end of the continuum, what is the answer? They're going to get it right or wrong. And frankly, there's more of a chance of getting it wrong than right. When you ask what might be, what could be, what's a possible answer, what's one option for this answer, suddenly they can't get it wrong. You only ask for a possible answer, a maybe, and that makes it much safer to venture into that learning zone because there's no particular consequence of getting it wrong. Now, of course, if you are asking a question with a single definitive answer, like what's 6 times 6, there's no point in saying what might be the answer to 6 times 6. The sort of questions we're talking about are the questions we want to explore, the questions that we want to feel safe venturing into our learning zone. The next element, and I should add before I move on, the adding tentativeness to our questioning made the single biggest difference to my classroom questioning of any other strategy. Once I shifted from asking for the answer to asking for a possible answer, what might be, what could be, what's those sort of words. And for me, it was nearly always might. That was the go-to word I used. Suddenly, the number of responses I got from students tripled at least. It's quite extraordinary how powerful just adding a tentative statement and possibly a plural to your questioning has, particularly for students at that low growth end. The third quality of a powerful question is that it has what we call an invitational stem. Now, an invitational stem is an invitation to that student individually. which doesn't mean you direct it at that student by saying, James, what do you think might be? It's the difference between these two questions. It's the difference between saying, what might be one of the reasons this experiment exploded, and asking, what do you think might be one of the reasons this experiment exploded? Just by asking that, what do you, invites each individual in the classroom to respond. The question, why might this experiment have exploded, just thrown out to the class, is easy to ignore. But when you say, what do you think might be one of the reasons, then it's more personal and aimed at the individual, each individual student. The fourth quality of a powerful question is this idea of a positive presupposition. Now, this is subtle and oh so powerful. A presupposition is a statement within the question that assumes something about the person. So, for example, lawyers are the kings and queens of presuppositions. They'll be cross-examining someone and they'll say, did you shoot or stab your wife? Now, the presupposition is that they shot or stabbed their wife. There's no sort of other option there. But when you flip that round to a positive way of using it, you get these sorts of changes. Rather than asking, do you know the answer? You ask, what answer do you know? The question pre-assumes that they have an answer. Rather than asking, what do you remember from last week's class? You ask, what are some of the things that you do remember from last week's class? And by building in the positive presupposition that they have an answer and a way of giving that answer, builds a sense of confidence in the student. And I've included some other examples of all these elements in the written section of this lesson. And the last one, and this might be an interesting one for some of us, is that we want to name the cognition. We tell the student how to go about answering the question, not what the answer is, but what sort of cognition, what needs to go on in their mind to help them answer it. So, for example, instead of asking what are some of the reasons that this experiment might have exploded, you ask, as you reflect on the process you went through, what do you predict might be some of the reasons this experiment exploded? So you're telling the student how to go about answering it. As you reflect on what you did, what do you predict might be? And by adding in these cognitive verbs, it gives students a label, a cognitive anchor to think about their thinking, to help them become more metacognitive. Now, a couple of things about this. First off, sometimes we struggle for the cognitive verb. We're not quite sure what type of thinking is required. And if we're not used to using cognitive verbs, then we struggle to come up with a word. In the beginning, take a list from Bloom's taxonomy and just take a stab. Any cognitive verb will do to start with until you get into the habit of using them. And to get into the habit of using them, there's something else you need to do. And that's stop using one particular word in your classroom. Now, I'm going to ban this word, and it's a word that you probably use every day. And there's one exception to when you can use it. And it takes a lot of effort to monitor yourself and to recognize you're using it and to stop using it. And it's going to surprise you. The word I'm banning in your classroom is the word think. I want you to stop asking your students to think. Now that might sound a little bit unusual, but when I asked you to think just then, think about what I'm doing here. What did you actually do? It's likely that one person watching this video found it funny. Another person reflected back to think, is there something that he's told us? Another person tried to analyze the problem. The point is that you did different things. The word think is what I call a collective verb. Now, that's not a real thing, but you can have collective nouns. Why can't you have collective verbs? But it's a very vague term. And what I want us to do is to be much more precise about the type of cognitive verbs that we're using. And one of the things you'll find is that often when you say the word think, you mean feel. You mean what emotional reaction are you having? So consider that. And also, when we say think, the only time we can say it legitimately in our classroom is when we're asking a question like this. What type of thinking might we need to be doing in order to solve this problem? So we say what sort of cognitive action, thinking, will be required. We're asking students to identify the cognitive verbs for themselves to drill down into the question. But other than that, I don't want to use the word think in the classroom. Monitor yourself. It's a hard one to recognise, hard one to change. So powerful questions. These 5 elements, the idea of plurals, asking for more than one answer, tentativeness, using words like might, could, possible, maybe, these sorts of words and phrases that signal to the students that they're not going to be wrong. It's a possible answer, not the answer. Enormously powerful as a positive mindset mover to make it safe for the students to go into their learning zone. The invitational stem, subtle but useful to ask, what do you think might be, rather than what might be. The positive presuppositions, as you become more fluent and more skillful at building in positive presuppositions into your questions, you'll have an enormous impact on students' responses to your questions. When you subtly tell the student that I know you can answer this and this is how you're going to do it, it opens up the confidence that the person, particularly on the low growth end of the continuum, lacks in going into their learning zone. And naming the cognition, getting good at explaining what type of thinking is going to be required to solve the problem. Now, there's a few questions here that I can use as examples, and here's one. First off, these are very, very good as discussion questions. These are very, very good as overarching topic questions, the sort of things we're going to explore lots. They don't work with narrow, definitive answers. If you're asking, what are the 3 parts of a flower, it's only marginally useful to say what might be. But here's the sort of question that I'll just put in your back pocket that you can use tomorrow. How many times have you got into a classroom and said, teach, 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 blah, 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 and then gone, any questions? Of course, no. All right, get on with your work. And what's the next thing that happens? Everyone puts their hand up. Instead of asking any questions, which is at least plural, reframe it, thinking about these powerful questions, these elements of powerful questions, as something like this. What might be, so the tentativeness, some, not all, of the questions that we might need to answer before we go on. Now, the positive presupposition in there is that there are questions to be asked before we go on. So you're expecting questions. When you just said any questions, some students in the class go, if you've got a question, you must be stupid. But instead now you're saying, what are some of the questions we might need to ask before we go on? You're actually saying out loud, I expect there to be questions right now. It's tentative, it's plural. I use the word we instead of you, and I did that deliberately when I said what might be some of the questions we need to ask, because for that particular question, giving it to the group rather than you makes it a bit safer again. There are lots of examples, and I've included some in the written section of this lesson. But I invite you to play with this. Have a go. Write a few powerful questions of your own in the comment section below. I'll respond to them. Be prepared. You're venturing into your learning zone. This is something that is a skill you'll need to develop. And the first few times you do it, you'll feel like you've got cotton wool in your mouth. You'll come out with this verbose sort of long question, and you can refine it over time. Don't start with all 5 elements, start with just 1 or 2. And my advice would be to consider starting with the idea of tentativeness in your questions. Enormously powerful for me, and I know for many other teachers. So let's have a go at designing your first powerful question, and then we'll move on.